she will give your instructions. So should I save those slides now, or do you want to send me something towards the end? And then get that? Yes. Okay. Why don't we start getting these things out? Yeah, just me. Good morning, good people. Is this thing on? Now it's on? Wow, because I totally cannot hear that it's on. Okay. It's good speaker design. All right, good morning, people. Please do be seated so we can get started. Welcome to this. This is our third incarnation, I believe, so far of the IETF 2.0 non-working group forming Bach. This is better? I honestly, because I can't even hear it like this. Oh, I see. Because I can't tell. It's like no different for me. Okay. So welcome, everyone, to this third incarnation of IETF 2.0. Always heartened to see how many people are so interested in the operations of the IETF. Thanks, everyone, for coming. I know there's all things that we would rather be doing, but we got to get this done. You know, there is absolutely no reason why this should inspire any technical thinking of anyone here, but should a technical idea come to you that you feel like you need to like run up to the microphone and share, note well, it is, as in every other context, covered by our intellectual property agreements with which you are all undoubtedly familiar. This is our plan for this morning. We're gonna hear the readout from the design team. It's going to be tag teamed by Brian and Yari, and I believe Leslie is sneaking in at the end of it as well in a previously unannounced cameo appearance. Following which, let's talk about this and see if we can actually hash this out this time. I think we're getting there. I think we're making a lot of progress. And provided it does seem like we've got a direction maybe coming out of this, I'm sure Alyssa will have some thoughts for us at the end of this. But these times, we got plenty of time. We got all the time we need to discuss this. I don't know if we're going to use it all, but we got it. Do we have anybody here who feels like this is such an important, this could be an historic moment for the IETF? We'd love to be able to record for posterity what has happened. Can we get a note taker for this out there in the audience? Because I know a lot of people come to this just to see this amazing spectacle, you know, not planning on participating, and I'm sure you'd be happy to write something down. Seriously though, is there anyone who can help with that? Yes, there is, we know, declining volunteerism, but we are not exemplifying that here today. It is not this day. This day we fight. No, seriously, please. Somebody's got to record. Oh, I see a hand in the back. That looks like MT. Thank you, MT. I know you've done this before too. You're a repeat offender, so we appreciate that. Anybody scribing this out to the Jabber, to the people in Jabberland? Unfortunately, we do have some remote participants this time. Thank you, Rich. It's very much appreciated. Perfect. So, but this plan look okay? Everybody think this is copacetic? I'm not hearing any objections to that. So I think in the tag teaming of this, how are we going to work this? We're going to, oh, that's my slide that I always have ready to hand. So I think Brian is going to be starting here as we go through this. Brian, are you in the Meet Echo?
I am.
I see you there. Oh, very good. Perfect.
So John, you
are we going to have your pick?
Slide 3.
Okay, so you want to go to the next slide? You're set?
Yes.
Okay. Please.
All right. So I'm going to try and make the first 2 bullets go real quick. I'd really rather focus more on the discussions and get to some of the open mic parts of this as quickly as possible. So next slide, please.
Next slide is up.
All right, so for those of you who haven't been around for the last couple of meetings, this is just a real quick overview of what's been going on and why we're here. Essentially, you know, we're looking at the changes in the administrative tasks over the last 10 years, and what has come about from that has been a number of changes, not only from the tasks that are being carried out, but also from the community's expectations for the functions that are being performed on the administrative side. And then to make things, you know, as fun as possible, we're also dealing with the fact that the world around us is changing. So the question that really boils down here is, you know, what administrative arrangement best supports the IETF going forward? Next slide, please. So in the draft, what we've done is we've tried to flesh out as much of the problems as we can to try and make sure everybody's on the same page with respect to the administrative tasks and the administrative arrangements that we have today. And essentially what we've come across is that there's a couple of families of problems that come up. The first one is lack of clarity. And underneath that, we actually come up with 4 different areas where people have identified where clarity has actually been the cause of some problems. First one being responsibility. You know, what is an IETF responsibility? What's an ISOC responsibility is not always clear at all times. The second one is actually in my mind a relatively big one, because it's kind of an offshoot of the fact that the IETF in and of itself is not an entity. So the question is who actually speaks for the IETF? And in different situations, different people have that role. And the question is which roles make the most sense for that representation? The third one has to deal with authority, whether or not we can make decisions with or without ISOC approval. And the fourth one is in the oversight arena. Where are the reporting chains, and who has the responsibility to carry out oversights in different situations? The second big area is in the lack of resources. The first one is in the volunteer side, where we've actually found that we don't necessarily have qualified volunteers to staff the IAOC roles. And the second one is within the staff, mainly because the IAD role has become overly complex and very taxing for a single person to carry out. The third one has to deal with transparency. Essentially, there's a perception that within the IAOC there are not necessarily as transparent functions and operations as there could be. And the fourth one is in the funding and operating model. There seem to be some mismatches that are causing us problems. Next slide, please, John. So within the document, what we did is we went through and we actually spelled out some of the goals of what we wanted to accomplish. And you can think of these as, what our, design requirements are going to be. The first set, clearly the first thing we want to do is we want to protect the IETF culture. We want to make sure that people who are providing financial support are kept independent of people who are making technical contributions. Second goal is really to improve the technical environment. We essentially want to make sure that we undertake changes that are going to better enable the technical contributors to keep making those technical contributions and not force them into becoming something that they're not. The third goal is to clear up the definition of the IETF and ISOC relationship. Part of the discussions within the problem statement dealt with clarity, and this is one of the big areas where we need to make sure that we have as clear a definition of what that relationship looks like as possible. The next one is re-envisioning the funding model, and essentially what we're trying to do here is make sure that as we define the new administrative functions, we're actually providing the support needed in order to address changes in the industry that might affect the funding that comes into the IETF. Tied back into the clarity issue, we really want to make sure that one of the key things that we get out of this work is making sure that the relationship between the IETF and ISOC from a money perspective is clearly defined. Next slide, John. Continuing on with the goals discussion, what we want to make sure we do here is as we build this new administrative capability, we want to make sure that we're making a clear documentation of all the roles and responsibilities for staff, contractors, and volunteers. And that really ties back into making sure that we define what that support staff is supposed to do and what responsibilities they have in doing those jobs. It's not necessarily completely clear in many instances where that where responsibilities lie, and people are picking them up ad hoc in order to make sure that things get done. The next one is actually trying to redefine or clearly define the role of the IETF community as it relates to some of these administrative activities. So as we're actually changing or redefining the responsibilities for the administrative staff, the role of the community will change, and we need to make sure that that's better defined so that people have a clear view of what kind of input and impact they can have on those tasks as they go forward. Clearly tied back into the problem statement, we just want to make sure that we're defining improved transparency requirements so that people are happy with the level of information being provided and the timeliness of that information being provided. And then finally, we need to make sure that we have a transition plan so that we know how we get from today's IASA structure to whatever new structure we define coming out of this activity. Next, John. And then for me, this is the last slide for me. So some of the things that went into the work within the document was really trying to figure out what those transition options look like. What the document does, it kind of defines, 3 representative structures. One being essentially an improved version of the current IASA function. The second one is actually formulating a subsidiary within ISOC. And in this particular case, that administrative structure lives within ISOC, but it keeps a separate set of resources, bank accounts, bylaws, charters, staff, boards from ISOC. And so it actually operates nearly independently, but it's still housed within ISOC. And then the third option is actually an independent organization where that administrative structure, again, has its own accounts and bylaws and charters, et cetera, but it's now within a new nonprofit organization outside of the ISOC umbrella. Regardless of any of those three approaches, there are still funding dependencies that the IETF would have on ISOC. Another key point here is that each of these different structures requires a slightly different definition of the relationship between ISOC and the IETF admin organization. In many of these situations, we're going to have to come up with a governance model so that we can actually control the behavior of the administrative function. And from the input that we've received, it appears that we're going to have to either increase or reorganize the staff resources to make sure that all these administrative tasks get done. So that's it for my part of the discussion. Any questions on those before we move to Yari?
All right, thank you, Brian.
All right.
We'll move on. Yari.
Good morning, everybody. So I just wanted to briefly go through some of the main points from the discussion that we've had so far, just to sort of bring everyone up to date on what the discussion has been. I did send out an email this morning that had a detailed list of the comments that we've received, sort of categorized in different categories. Do take a look at that. I'm not planning to go over everything in that email today or here on during the meeting, but that can be a source for you to look at in the coming days. And that email had most of stuff in it, obviously not the discussion that we've had this morning on the email list. And also I forgot a few pieces of feedback. I think Lucy's feedback did not make it there, for instance. Apologies for that. So thank you for all this feedback. Not a huge number of people, but a fair number of people who did comment, and everybody had done quite a lot of work on sort of analyzing where are we and what kind of thoughts they have on the document and the space in general. So the feedback that we have is basically around the options. First of all, like which direction should we choose? There's some discussion, obviously, about the ISAC relationship that also relates to the option issue. There was some discussion of staff issues around some practical elements of that, as well as more generally, do we want that and so forth, and what size and so on. A few comments around IETF trust. There was some discussion of the IETF and IETF admin org roles and how they relate, and some more specific questions, for instance, about being clear about the IETF chair role versus what the executive director of the admin org would do and how they relate. Funding, we have a proposal for an advisory council in the document as well. Some people had asked about that, to what extent that is needed, or would that just be an extra layer? We had some discussion of volunteers. So one of the problems that was mentioned, that we have lack of volunteers, or not really lack of volunteers, but maybe lack of volunteer cycles. One question was whether we could actually sort of formally commit volunteers, or have the volunteers commit to some tasks in a more formal way than we do today. Some organizations definitely do that. We haven't done that in the IETF. We had some good discussion about the comparisons. Brian, for instance, sent us good feedback on that. Had missed some points there, so the next version will make the comparisons clearer and more fair to all of the options. And we had also some missing items. Next slide, please. So I just plan to go through a couple of items here to highlight, not the details that somebody raised, but sort of bigger threads in the discussion. So one sort of key point here, I guess, is that while the document does bring three options forward, it's important to understand that IASA++ and as well as the other ones are actually more, they're fluid options. It's more of a spectrum. We need to discuss in detail exactly what those things mean, and you can sort of go further along a particular direction or less further along. So we have to decide those kinds of things. And then some of the bigger discussion in the email list, at least, was, I guess, between two different viewpoints. One is that, if we had, and this is basically represented by the design team, that it would be worth having a clear organizational boundary, and then that will make multiple things clear in the organization, and then the design of the organization is better, and as a result of that, it's easier for us to do our job. The other viewpoint is that if you add more organizational structure, then that's has more bureaucracy and distance from a funding source. And there's some truth, obviously, to both of those viewpoints, and we have to discuss exactly where the final truth is, and have to understand also that it's so for instance, if we have new organizational structures, they might in some cases not always just being new bureaucracy, but just make things clearer, and then it actually just works. So obviously bureaucracy for the sake of bureaucracy is bad. We don't want that. The question is, can we do it in a smart fashion? Next slide, please. And then the options obviously affect the ISAC relationship. There were a couple other items worth mentioning here, I think, in addition to that. So the one point, I forget who made this point, but as long as the IETF is reliant on ISAC for funding, they will have a degree of control, regardless of what the sort of formal arrangements are and how independent or non-independent we are, and from an organizational perspective, and that's true, of course, and we should not forget that. And also, it was, and I think there's no contention about that point. And also, it was made a point that it's important to retain a close relationship with ISAC, which I think people also agree with. Then there was sort of more unclear opinions about to which extent the subsidiary or independent options should change the way that IETF does budgeting or funding. Do we have a fixed budget as soon as we have a different organization than the funding model, which is today is more of a, I would classify that on a need basis kind of thing. Does that change because of the organizational structure or not? And also an important but sort of a minor thing, but it's good to handle all of these loose ends. What to do in the possible future evolution. So in the document, for instance, we talked about what happens if we actually decommission, and if we create a subsidiary, for instance, decommission that someday, how that happens and who decides and so forth. So there were some opinions around how that gets done. Next slide, please. Staff and contractors. There's a bigger role for staff and contractors, I think, in the what we are envisioning for, I guess, all of the options. So whether they're employed by the IETF admin org or ISOC, or if they're contractors, that means essentially increased number of people working for the IETF. And there was some sort of details of this were discussed. I'm not going to touch that, but there are some more general issues like, is this a good thing, a bad thing? How do we handle that? What does it mean? I guess some growth seems unavoidable, merely because we have, I think, over time, seen growth of kinds of tasks that need to be done, and possibly some decline of volunteer ability or time. Everybody's like all tied up in their own businesses, and they can't necessarily contribute significant amounts of time so easily. And also, we're having some personal changes going on the IETF at the moment. So we're replacing one IAD with a temporary IAD, and it's likely that we cannot have exactly one-to-one mapping. So the organization will probably grow a little bit because of that, to make sure that we cover all aspects. So I think some of that is unavoidable. We could discuss, exactly how far we should be going there, but then there's a question of how do we make sure that this, whatever organization we have stays in the control of the IETF, executes the things that the IETF community actually wants. And we do need to ensure that our oversight processes, our roles are clear, and we have a control ability in the IETF community to steer whatever we have. Next slide. IETF Trust. Couple of people commented that the IETF Trust should probably stay out of this reorg, at least in the early design phases. I think that makes a lot of sense. And that also, IETF Trust serves other parties in the world as well. If we try to reorg ourselves and also negotiate with those other parties, I think that's a bit of a too big mess. So let's not do that. The other thing, some people asked about the difference between IETF admin org and IETF, and we tried to emphasize this in the document. There was some discussion with me and Stephen this morning also about this matter. So the design team wanted to be very clear that we want this administrative function to be that's the IETF admin org, and that serves the IETF, but it's not the IETF. So if we have an executive director, for instance, or we have sort of formal existence for the IETF admin org, that does not mean that we have formal existence for the IETF, or that the executive director would have any say in, say, how the ISG operates, or how working groups operates, or any effect on how we have participants into IETF. And I think that's really, really important in keeping the IETF culture. Next slide. Missing items. There were several. One item was that we sort of didn't really discuss IRTF or IAB in any fashion, whether they're being served by the admin org, or their relationship to ISOC, whether that should change in some fashion. Next slide. So that's the summary of the feedback. There are some next steps that we should be doing. Obviously, we need to think about where do we want to go here. We've done the analysis and work to a certain level in the design team. Probably need some further work as well, but it would be really good if, at least from the point of view of people who were trying to write this document, if we were able to get some feedback from you all, like what direction should we go to, and so we could investigate that direction in more depth. And certainly, if we actually decide to go for a particular model, and that involves in practical work, writing documents, some RFC changes, contracting lawyers to look at how do you create new structures, or how do you draft contracts, and so forth. So getting this direction from you would be really important, that we would know what to do, and then we'll be able to have the details easier. I guess what remains is discussion. We did have Leslie, if you could come up, and so in the design team we have had obviously some opinions ourselves about what's reasonable and what's not reasonable, and maybe you can say a few words about that. And since you are the one in the fire in the IOC at the moment, so seem appropriate that you talk about what's working for you, and what kinds of issues you see in some of these options.
Thanks. Yeah, actually, I think that's part of the perspective that I bring, although I will be clear that I'm speaking as an individual and not wearing any particular hats. I've also had various other perspectives over the years. So part of what I've tried to do here is capture an articulation of one of the points of discussion on the mailing list has been that the document itself does not describe what does or doesn't work about the IASA++ model, and it does convey what is in fact the opinion of the design team, which is that the right answer here seems to be somewhere in the continuum between subsidiary model and independence. And there's no, I will pause a moment and say, I don't think that that's an assertion that we have all of the right answers or all of the details, but as Jari said, we're trying to get some sense at this point in time of, where on the overall spectrum we should go. So with regards to the IASA model and the IASA++ model in the document, I will observe we are two organizations that are in separate, at least in our own minds, and trying to operate together as one. So to try to give some concrete sense of what that looks like from the part of the world that you don't normally see if you're not on the IAOC, I've put together a table with some of the challenges that we feel, and I've attempted to articulate it from the perspective of those two separate organizations. And I will apologize up front that this is my articulation of it. I obviously see the IETF side more clearly than the ISOC side. So this is not meant, if I've expressed anything incompletely, that's my expression problem. This is not meant to be critical, but rather just to illustrate the challenges inherent in having two organizations operating together. So with all that as preamble, so for instance, as we have it now, ISOC employs all IETF staff, our one staff member. And from the IETF perspective, we recognize that the ID is an ISOC employee. But from the ISOC perspective, ISOC is an Order 100 person organization with its own mission and directions and work to accomplish in any given year. And it's not entirely clear where this IAD employee fits in those plans, because he's an IETF employee, or she's an IETF person. That's fine. That's normal. We've coped with it for a dozen years. But then we can look at things like personnel management and review. The IAD works with and for the IETF, and the IOC is, per BCP 101, responsible for hiring and firing and annual reviews and so on. So it does the annual performance review in the context of the HR framework that is established by the organization of which the IAD is an employee. From the ISOC perspective, they have an employee for which they don't have enough involvement in the work to be able to do the review anyway, irrespective of what BCP 101 says. So here's another sort of bit of friction or disconnect between trying to make these two organizations fly as one. When it comes to personnel details, for instance, we ran into a little bit of we bumped up against this wall when it came time, to our astonishment, to find a successor IAD. And in order to properly set compensation for any successor IAD, it seemed rational to have information and details on compensation of the existing IAD, since we do, after all, approve the budget and all that good stuff. But understand from the ISOC perspective, as a matter of proper maintenance of personnel information, you can't really go handing all that detail off to people who have no formal relationship with your organization. So, another bruise from that particular wall. Next slide, please. For contracts, we have a few of those. We're enjoying this hotel because of one of them, for instance. So the IETF, with all of its assorted contractors and whatnot, negotiates the terms and establishes contracts terms aligned with its needs, expectations, and relationships. Because we know these people with whom we are contracting in some cases, and because we've established relationships with hotel chains and whatnot. And ISOC, the organization, is the signer of these contracts because it's the legal entity, and therefore it has to be comfortable with the legal terms in the contract, because it is ISOC that suffers exposure in the things that get signed. And finding the line between what is, something that we should renegotiate because it's exposure for ISOC versus it's changing the terms and the nature of the relationship that the IETF expects, sometimes is a little bit challenging. I hope that's clear enough in concept. I certainly don't want to try to go into any particular details, but I mean, just appreciate that this is, again, natural, different requirements from the two different organizations. Business support software resources, for example, the IETF would like to select its own software to support its work. Earlier this year, we were discussing the use of Salesforce for some of the sponsorship work. ISOC has its own rationalized IT arrangements, and in order to enter into an agreement with Salesforce, well, we have to go through an IT review, and does this really fit with where we want to go? So longer discussion. Again, that's just a reality of two different organizations. The IETF has an ideology about best practices, open source, eat our own dog food. So this is sort of a flipped perspective. If we really are one organization, then ISOC should be aligned with our ideology and also doing open source and so on and so forth. But from the standpoint of trying to make that Order 100-person organization do business, why the heck would you do that? I mean, I think many of us come from commercial organizations where we respect open source, et cetera, but maybe we aren't using open source software to run our businesses, for instance. And then finally, and this was touched on earlier for representation, the IETF makes its own choices and needs to be able to represent itself to organizations and attract sponsorship and other financial support. But we've had feedback over the years. This is a rather older example, but certainly it was the case that various people would say, why the heck is it every time there's an IETF coming up, I get a phone call from this guy at ISOC? Because it's ISOC staff doing the work for the IETF, but how do you get the right balance of representing who is us and when are we us and when are we separate entities? So that's a little bit of a flavor of where we bump up against issues and frictions as we each try to be our own individual organizations and yet march as one in the context of supporting the IETF. And that's what I had.
Thank you, Leslie. Any questions for Leslie or for the design team about this? Yes, and Yare, you probably could profitably stand up here as well for this part. Do people hearing the characterization of the feedback and the situation as Leslie is describing it, does this seem like the facts on the ground? Maybe that might be a good place to start, or people think this is an accurate characterization of?
John has a hat.
It's not making anything again, is it? It's red, so.
Yeah. So hi, I'm John Levine. I'm wearing a variety of hats here.
Eat the microphone.
It thinks it's on.
You gotta really get close.
This is the Bing Crosby approach. As Leslie knows, I'm both a member of the IAOC and the chair of the legal committee. And when I turn my hat around, I'm also a member of the ISOC board and its corporate secretary. And everything you say is absolutely correct. We absolutely need more. We need to be able to draw a line between this is the IETF and this is ISOC because of all the administrative issues we've got. On the other hand, I think it has not been super productive to obsess about, like, are you going to be a subsidiary or the? I'm just wondering in the discussion of the various organizations, has the phrase private foundation ever come up? Sounds like it hasn't. Okay, that's why a separate organization won't work. And I gather you're getting a briefing from Sandy later, and she'll explain why. So, wow. So what I would encourage us to do is figure out what the administrative structure needs to be. Assuming that there's going to be some sort of IETF Inc. What would the board look like? How would you have a business board separate from the program board? It might be like the committees. Figure out how it's going to be selected. A subsidiary of ISOC can be run totally independently. PIR is, in my opinion, astonishingly independent of ISOC. We talk to them maybe once a year, and I think and one other comment is that it is not realistic to imagine an IETF that is not still predominantly funded by ISOC. I mean, you will never find so much money with so few strings anywhere else, and and I think about half of the ISOC board is here in the room. I think we all feel the same way. It's like, although ISOC has grown way beyond what it used to be. I mean, ISOC, at this point, the IETF is about 10% of ISOC's budget, and it used to be a lot more. And that's not because the IETF has shrunk; it's just because ISOC has grown otherwise. And so, I think we figure out, like, how would we choose the administrative, basically the corporate board that would be in charge of the contracts. How do we figure out, are they the same people who are going to, figure out the other administrative issues? And I think so that the legal stuff will fall out fairly obviously from that.
Thank you. And just a quick reply. I do agree that the details of exactly how you structure the organization, that's what would matter, and maybe even more than like discussing of the high level bits when we get to the how do we select the board and such. That's where the substance really is.
Come back. Here's a space waiting for you.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm one of two people in this room who's actually incorporated a nonprofit and gotten a tax exemption. Three, okay. Yeah, 5, okay, but
if we can just make this simplest, perhaps. I think the first order of business is understanding which side of the line people feel that we should fall on, whether we sort of haul closer into ISOC, i.e. figure out how to make IASA++ work, or whether we pursue some structure that has some independence.
We clearly
and if the latter, then yes, indeed, there are other structures or details to be worked out.
Yeah, no. With my ISOC hat, it is clear that we need enough structural separation that Kathy doesn't have to sign all the contracts that she's never seen before.
Thank you, John.
Tobias Gondrom, not wearing IEOC hat, just personal opinion. Two quick comments. One thing I'm not sure whether you touched enough is we have this funding, going for sponsorships by ISOC. And some of these sponsorships are for ISOC, and some of the sponsorships are for IETF collected by ISOC. But also in the end, like, these things merge and like sometimes create confusion. I think we've seen this in the past, and actually from the list of the things that you mentioned, this would probably be one of the rather on the top for me, how to solve that. And one, let's say, observation as a outgoing IOC member, all of the things you mentioned are absolutely right. I just want to also give a little balance to this. All of these things we did manage to overcome, to handle. So these are not things that we cannot handle. Every single thing, it's kind of uncomfortable, but like, I don't want you guys to get the impression this is unsolvable. Like, every single one of these we have solved in operation. Not in the best way, but like, this is not a burning platform per one single item. That the mass of the things is what kind of drives this, in my humble personal opinion.
Thank you. And I guess, this is ISA 2.0. So obviously we have a working system, and we're not in danger in any fashion. But the question is, can we improve? That's why we do 2.0.
Hi, Wendy Seltzer, with a couple of different perspectives. One is from W3C, as the World Wide Web Consortium is also not a legal entity, and we are also struggling with these sorts of questions of how do we make it easier for ourselves to sign contracts, do work, and form an oversight structure. For those who don't know, W3C is hosted by, 4 host institutions, each of which manage the employees, and through the consortium manage our arrangements.
So you have the problem in quadruplicate.
We do indeed, and yet we too are finding it a grand challenge to move to a legal entity type structure, or even find the consensus on what that would look like. But then looking at this set of alternatives from the perspective of a participant, and I see a lot that's been working quite well as is, and that one thing I didn't see reflected so much in some of the alternatives further on toward independence was the sort of institutional motivations that building a more independent institution, creates the institutional momentum to do more as institution, and that potentially gets further away from just do the things that the community needs. So, as a participant here, I find myself toward the IASA plus end of the spectrum.
So before you get too far from the microphone, just so that I understand what you're saying, are you concerned that an independent organization for IETF-admin.org, IETF-admin.org, can't say org without a dot before it, sorry, would essentially get a life of its own and try to go off and mission itself?
Yes, and not through any malice of any of the participants, but through the just differences in motivations and incentives, and the sort of ongoing organic development of the organization.
Wendy, before you go, could I ask as well? How do you see that being different with ISOC, I guess? I mean, so on some level, right? I mean, there are people who do these roles, and they have their own kind of, mission creep wherever they are, right? So you can't eliminate that. The question is just, is it better for the IETF as an organization if the place where that creep could take place is closer to us or maybe more distant from us?
So I see not building extra layers of administrative structure and not adding places. So don't. I guess I see that as less pronounced within ISOC than by building additional structures.
Yeah, I wanted to add that's the tension between the additional layers of structure and then having better control. So I personally prefer having great control and clear roles, so that I as community could affect what's happening, as opposed to just minimizing the layers but having less control.
Ted Hardy speaking, no particular hat on. I got up originally when John Levine was talking, because he said, and all of this will fall out into an obvious legal structure, which caused my billable hours sense to go bing, 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 bing over the top of everything else I was hearing, because that didn't seem to me very likely. I think the point I would make in reacting to this is that almost everything you've described here could be handled in multiple ways if you really had multiple business units, and that the legal structure around those business units isn't the critical part. It's making very clear what it's possible for the business units to make independent choices about and what it is not. Except, and there's a big except here, and that's the fundraising part. I think the point Jason Livingood made on the list, and which Andrew also made, is that even if we could make all of the business unit issues between the different parts of ISOC, as we are now, go away, that would not clarify to external funding sources the difference between them. And so when I look at this, really the only box that I think should be in bright red is the bottom right one, where you have, why is ISOC calling me about the IETF? And if what we need to do to solve that problem is an organizational structure that makes that branding significantly different in the eyes of the funders for both of the missions of ISOC, I think that's important for us to recognize as a reason we're doing it, because I think it also hints to us that the amount of structure we need and the amount of staff we need shouldn't be changing that much as a result of this. I did see the slide where Jari said, you know, there are new things we want to do, and setting up such a structure obviously involves things that new organization will have to do. But we also should be very, very careful that we don't try and use this exercise to obscure other issues with energy within the community, and substituting staff energy for especially the technical work of the IETF is something we've avoided for many, many years, and I think should still be on top of our mind as we consider the next structure. Thanks.
Brian Carpenter, no hat. I just have to plead guilty to having been a member of the original IAOC, and therefore it's all my fault. Leslie, thanks very much for this analysis. That's actually very, very useful, I believe. What I really wanted to say is, let's assume that we go for a new org. Let's assume that we realize that means we have to obsolete RFC 4071, rewrite a new version. Right? Well, the current version took about a year and a half to write, as I remember. It wasn't done very quickly, and we weren't even talking about incorporating something as part of the process until the IETF trust came up at the last moment. So this is going to take a long time, being realistic, even if there was a decision today on which direction to follow. So I would suggest, once the problem analysis is generally agreed, and we're pretty close to that, I think, splitting the problems into two heaps. The heap that can be fixed by the IAOC in its present form operating under BCP 101 and the IAD just fixing the problems, right? Because it's within their power to fix the problems. And the other heap are the things that can't be fixed without structural change. And run those two operations in parallel, because then you start to get some of the problems solved in the next 3 months, maybe, you know, rather than waiting 18 months for a document to get written and approved and an organization to get incorporated and all the other things that will go on. So I think we have the opportunity to do some things pretty soon that would fix some of the problems.
Yeah, I think my only observation there, and I suppose I'm wearing my IOC chair hat in this, is that it will be easier to do that with a sense of where the community wants to land. So,
Andrew Sullivan. So this is quite awkward, isn't it? I agree with what you just said, Leslie, but I think I disagree with Brian's claim that we seem to be pretty close on the fundamental thing here, because I don't think we are. I think that's what the problem is, and we're dancing around it. The question, people keep suggesting, for instance, oh, well, we've got this problem, we're going to create a new bureaucracy and so on, or that there are going to be a bunch of costs that we're going to have to pay and the like. And I think that that is allowing the structural mechanisms we have right now to obscure costs that somebody is paying now. Right now, we've got a bunch of externalized costs, and some of them are externalized by from ISOC onto us. That is, for instance, the fundraising problem, right? Why is ISOC calling me over the IETF? So we end up with this cost where we can't do the fundraising we might want because of the structural issues. And then there are things that are externalized from us into ISOC, and there's been some effort to try to fix that in accounting, like how much is ISOC spending on communication staff, or how much is ISOC spending on doing the accounting for this and so on. And that's currently just externalized from us, right? It's subsumed under the larger piece, and we haven't thought about that very carefully. People keep suggesting, for instance, we'd create new bureaucracy. Well, that bureaucracy is going to exist. You're going to have it, right? Somebody's got to do supervision of employees and so on. And it just happens to be that at the moment we don't have to pay for that. Well, that's no good, right? That's costing us in a different sense, because when we run into the example here is, for instance, the contracting issue, then we simply don't have control over that, and now we have to negotiate those issues under a case where we haven't had to be responsible for a long time, and now we need to be. And I think, therefore, we need to decide whether we want to be grown-ups about this and run those things and actually do them, or accept that we're simply an activity of ISOC, and in that case, ISOC is going to make those decisions for us. Maybe it's going to make them, and I think so far it has made them, in a benevolent way, but really that's a choice that we need to make. ISOC appears to be, from all indications, completely supportive of what we want to do here, and the question is, do we want to be grown-ups and do this, or do we want to continue to be wards of ISOC? Either way is okay with me, if the community picks one or the other, but I don't think we're being clear about which of those we're going to do, and I think that decision would be helpful.
Just sort of as a follow-on to both that and Brian's comment, I think that over the course of the last year, we have been actually, well, the last couple of years, we've been trying to better capture the ISOC expenses on some of the stuff that was sort of rolled up into their budget, but also taking a little bit more responsibility for and charge of some of the external activities such as sponsorship. And Joe, I don't know if you got on the line to talk about what you've been doing in the past year, and if people might permit Joe to sort of follow up to Mike as a bit of a follow-on.
So Joe Aberley, current IETF sponsorship person. I just wanted to, the few people have pointed out that, and they have obviously painful memories that are still not yet suppressed, that they've been called and it's been ambiguous who's the call has been for, and they don't know why the style of sponsorship acquisition is as it is for the IETF, because perhaps it's jarring in some way. Nobody, I believe, has been called in the last 6 months from somebody who purports to be from ISOC. Cold calling is not the approach that I've been trying to do. I'm not suggesting for a second that the sponsorship problem is solved, because we still have lots of work to do. But that particular ambiguity, as Leslie pointed out when she went over the cell in the spreadsheet, is kind of an older problem. So it's not, I don't think, a current area of concern, but it's good to hear that it's important.
And even so, I think that there are still some challenges of hiring an IETF person to work within the ISOC framework to raise money on behalf of the IETF.
Yeah, and just a quick follow-up to what Andrew was saying. You were talking about externalizing costs, and somebody's going to pay for a particular thing, whether it's us visibly or ISOC. I wanted to make the friendly amendment that if you have a clear organization, then that you're just sort of moving money around, or the payee is different. But if you have a too complicated organization, now your cost not only moves from one place to another, but may also be bigger, because you could be like negotiation with 3 parties instead of 2.
Eric Scorla, I'm just wearing a hat. I am glad to hear we're not just cold calling people. That's good. I can say that as someone who was like a sort of microscopic donor to IETF in the past, certainly I was confused as to, and that was like 4 months ago, as to like why I was negotiating with ISOC over who's deliver the money. So I'm not sure that problem is like actually entirely solved. And we haven't heard too much from the global hosts, so maybe some of the people could get up and talk about their experience. Because I remember last time people were saying there was confusion, and so maybe that confusion still exists. That was my impression, at least. But I actually got up to talk about this sort of issue of sort of staff capture of IETF. I too am concerned about this issue. I guess what I'm surprised to hear is that people think that issue is an issue that is created by having a subsidiary rather than the other way around. I look around and I see ISOC has like an enormous staff, and a lot of these people are technical people who are doing technical work, and they show up at IETF and do technical work here. And W3C has kind of the same structure, where they have like technical people do technical work. And so having an organization which is in fact chartered has dual charter roles, one of which is to do technical stuff, and the other is to support IETF. That's what creates staff capture. Having an organization which is chartered entirely to make sure that like the trains run on time, we have hotel rooms, is what creates non-staff capture. I've never had to have a conversation with Alexa about what TLS had to do, but I actually have plenty of conversations with ISOC staff about what TLS had to do.
Alexa, I think that's an action item.
Yeah.
I'm glad. This is Pete Resnick. Eckert took care of one of the things on my little list here. And yeah, setting up a set of articles of incorporation and bylaws and mission statement for a new thing is something that does not exist now with the current structure. Yeah. So one thing quick that is on the list of missed things is ISOC currently has an appeal, nomcom, et cetera, set of functions that was not mentioned in the document. I don't think it's going to be hard to figure out what to do about that, but it has to be dealt with. The thing that I mainly came up about was right now, the way I sell my employer to do something financially for the IETF is, say, become a member of ISOC. Because member is really important to my organization. They love that word, member. And it's not clear to me how we make that happen if it's an independent entity. And so I think we're still tied into getting people to be members of ISOC to make money. And so I don't think that last problem of why is ISOC calling me goes away. It actually, for me, is an easier selling point because I can say, ISOC supports IETF, become a member of ISOC. That's a good thing. And so that's simple from my organizational standpoint. The sort of bigger overarching question, and I'm hoping the answer is relatively simple, is ISOC at this point, and this is, I guess, to the board or to Kathy, sort of, you guys talk amongst yourselves about what you want the outcome to be, and we don't have a strong opinion yet of what we think the outcome should be? Or does ISOC have an opinion about what the outcome should be at this point yet, and what the financial connection will be, et cetera, and so forth? It would be nice to hear if there was a direction, or we're just free to make a choice and then ISOC will sort of review it and tell us how they feel. Gonzalo.
I was having some problem with John's charger there. He didn't want me to come here. So I think we made it quite clear when we passed the resolution a few months ago. This works better. Yeah. So I think we made it quite clear when we passed the resolution on these restructuring charges, which our position is like, you guys seem to, be basically considering several options. Some of them, they will basically need some initial funding. We are very happy to do that. We have allocated $1 million so far. I think that should be plenty, but we could discuss about that. So having said that, this is an IETF community decision. So obviously we have our personal opinions, and I can remove my hat and talk about what I think, but I don't think that would be actually a good idea, to be honest. So you guys decide what you want to do. We will support it. Talking with some of you this morning and in the previous days, they were also wondering about the money flow, right? I mean, that's not going to change. We are happy to support the IETF, whether it's, whatever you want it to become. So in that sense, I think that's what Pete was asking. So it's really your decision, and we are happy to support. I don't know, what else can I say?
Hi, Sean Turner. I guess I'm the treasurer of ISOC. So the other thing, I guess some other things, but I want to say, but it's kind of a reaction to what Gonzalo had to say and the question that you raised and things that I've heard in other times. Like we went to RIPE one time, and the kind people, they gave us a donation to ISOC, which ended up going to the IETF endowment. And some people have said some things said some things, and Aaron did as well. They gave us like $1 million, and RIPE gave us like 100,000 euros over 10 years or something. I mean, that's great, right? Their question was, well, why are we giving you this money? Are you as ISOC running away? Like, are you kicking the IETF out? And people said that on the IASA 2.0 list, and my brain is exploding. Nobody in ISOC on the board, or anybody that I think that works for ISOC, has ever said that. I have no one has said like, hey, get the hell out of here. Here's your $1 million and buzz off, right? That's not the thing that's happening. So, okay. And I guess to your specific question about are these things that you've, heard over the years as a participant, I guess I'm taking my hat off as ISOC. Yes. I think paraphrasing, I would argue maybe about where a comma was in one of the sentences or whatever, that pretty much nails it. Personally, I think that it makes much more sense to professionalize the organization. I think ISOC is in the throes of doing that itself. And I think that the IETF has grown up over many years and needs to continue to do that. And being in control of its things and not having to, like, in some sense, like, hey, where the hell are you? Can you sign this thing? Is a little crazy for contracts. It seems like it makes a little bit more sense to have some more control. So that kind of puts me personally, which I guess I'm going to go ahead and do, kind of in the middle and not in the spectrum from left from 1 to 3, kind of more in the middle of 2. Thank you. Oh, and one more thing. I guess the final thing is the whole, like, fundraising thing. We hear this all the time from people. I get an earful. And I mean, it seems like it's been kind of fixed in the past 6 months, because it got fixed because the leaders agreed to basically, like, do it a certain way, which is like, don't call and have separate. And I think that just kind of makes more sense, because I hear this from people all the time. Like, why are they calling me? It's crazy.
So could I ask?
Sure.
You know, I know there are some people here who are sponsors.
Yeah, absolutely.
The
Yeah, we
IETF,
thank them. Thank you very much for your continued sponsorship.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be great to hear from them to the degree to which they feel like this is fixed, that or it's now clear kind of what the right way is to give money to the IETF. So again, I see Gonzalo getting up.
So
again.
yeah,
I'm
I mean,
sorry,
it's
I know
another
you
person
were
who
just
writes
here
a big
second
check,
ago.
right? So I mean, that's true, but I think the other thing is the sponsorship committee, like, that they started on the AOC. Like, I hope has heard that recently, right? Yeah, I'll yield the floor here.
And while Gonzalo is walking up, I'll just put in a plug too for my probably now expired draft, the IASA retrospective document, because in that tried to capture a little bit of yes, these are two organizations, ISOC and the IETF, that have taken on new challenges and have both been growing over the last dozen years. To your point about ISOC as well, going through some changes.
Hi, I'm Jonas Hoininen, and I was part of I think the first IAOC or something like that, very early on. Haven't been that involved for some time, but following this IASA 2.0 discussion. Couple of things first. So the new document is, I think it's much more kind of like mature than the previous ones, which is of course to be expected. And it is much clearer on the kind of like problems and how to solve them and stuff like that. And I do agree that it is time to do some change after 10 years. So that is good as well. But the thing is, what I'm kind of like a little bit still worried in this discussion, that we're talking about that doing the legal kind of organizational change to a legal structure or something like that will automatically change something, or keeping something in ISOC internally as an activity is really bad and couldn't change something. I mean, like Ted said, in many organizations, things like these can be done as a different business unit that has different rules than the rest of the organization. Like, ISOC is a very tiny organization, 100 people. Really, the kind of like HR processes and things like that are not based on law can be made, I think, flexible enough for the IETF to function internally. If it's preferred to have it as a little bit more external as a subsidiary, that's doable as well. But I don't think that any of these kind of like three possibilities are really needed to achieve what is wanted. It is a question of will and a question of what is a preferred way of kind of like doing that. All have a legal and or organizational structure that is possible. So I don't think that's a question about being grown up or not. I think the kind of like having a separate budget for IETF can be done within the organization or outside the organization, whatever way it is possible. Personally, then on these kind of like three options, I would say the two first ones are something that I would support. The third one I would see as very problematic because it might open up discussions that we we don't have to go into in the others, like in which jurisdiction IETF should be incorporated. What is the kind of like, what are the contracts then in place with ISOC and so on, which I think that would be an unfortunate or too complex way of doing this. Then about the last thing that I wanted to make is the about ISOC calling us or not. I really don't see this as a problem. The question is about the execution more. If the person that calls from ISOC says this is clearly for IETF, I think organizations understand that, at least organizations that have been around for a long time, because we know what the relationship with ISOC and IETF is. However, if the person from ISOC calls and says, like, I have these 3 things I need money for, and they're all separate, and one of them is IETF, yeah, that could confuse things. But this is, again, it's not a question about structural separation or branding. It's a question about execution more.
So, Tobias gone. Oh, I need to. Okay, maybe I take this in my hand. So first, like as a member of the finance committee, I would say ISOC has been always very, very generous and like super helpful in any time if there was a budget gap. Okay, so it's like I have never encountered a situation where ISOC would not have said, "Sure, no problem, we take care of it." With this going to the donors, like if you are an external entity, some people may think, okay, so like Pete triggered this thought in me. Am I a member of IETF or am I a member of ISOC? Because ISOC has a different mission. Okay, so a slightly different mission. You are more outward policy oriented. And that might have different motivations for sponsors to say yes or no. And I'm not judging on that. The last thought is, you say all these donations actually are not an issue. I'm not so sure, because if I donate to ISOC one way or the other, it ends all in the ISOC budget. And like, even if I donate to IETF, it means ISOC needs to later give less to IETF to make up the difference, or to say it in a positive way, if I give to ISOC, in the end, they will always take care that IETF works. So like from a donor perspective, actually these 2 things do merge into each other one way or the other, because ISOC is so generous and helps us always. So I'm not sure this is totally isolated as you describe it from a donor perspective.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is actually, as Tobias was saying, a bit more complicated than just, a simple answer. But first, I mean, you were asking about as a global host, I think they are called like that, as Ericsson in particular. And I agree with Jonne that, I mean, we made this work. It was problematic. Now that all the contracts are signed, we are giving money every year. I mean, it kind of works. So for us, it's really not a problem. But when we did this original, it was a problem, because you had to justify, basically, as Peter said, my organization also loves memberships, and we are already a member of ISOC. So when I go there and we need to pay whatever more, it's not really clear. Another problem is basically that, ISOC basically, the 3 legs we have, right, like technology, policies, and communities, they come from 3 different corporate budgets. One is, CSR, the other is more like standards and CTO office, and the other is more like the lobbyist type of thing. So it's actually complicated. We let our platinum members earmark their money, so they can actually, channel their money directly to the IETF, but not if you are contributing less. So that could be something that could be fixed. But anyway, I mean, just, in short, I think for new donors or sponsors of the IETF, it would be actually useful to have more clarity into, where your money is going.
Barry Lebo, Huawei. Directly answering Sean's question, I think it's actually kind of an odd question. Huawei understands that we support IETF by going through ISOC. If that changes and we support IETF in another way, Huawei will continue to support IETF in whatever way it's set up to be supported. So the structure isn't relevant from that point of view. We should decide what we need administratively, and the rest of it, I believe, will fall out. I think we got where we are because ISOC grew, right? ISOC, not so much in size, although somewhat, but in scope. So if we decide that we need a different administrative structure and to separate our legal administrative structure from ISOC, we need to make sure we define that in a way that isn't going to also grow in scope in the same way and become another problem 10 years later. So we need to be careful about that.
Thank you. Damian Muzio with Cisco Systems. I work with David Ward and have been behind the scenes driving the operations side for IETF sponsorship and ISOC. As I sit and listen to everybody, I think everybody's on their same track. So as a host and sponsor, I'm optimistic of what's happening, but I do believe that there's an element of clarity, consistency, and channeling. I think I've heard all those three words so far already being spoken. Clarity of just who we're dealing with. I myself, after the 8-10 years, the only thing that's consistent is the I. The rest of it is whether it's ISOC or IETF, it gets meddled. And I need to, I think the opportunity, and that's with both organizations, to figure that out on how to create that clarity across the two. Consistency of just how we give money and support money. So we do, we give money to, for equipment donations that go to ISOC that help third world countries and drive that. We do a lot with IETF as a host. We do hackathons. We do the bits and bytes. I mean, there's all these different elements that we need to be able to understand and know where they're coming from and how we're approached. And I think we get talked to by both sides of ISOC and IETF to do that. And then the channeling aspect is we do want to channel money into the right places and know that it's going there and know that we're getting value with each one of those investments that happen. Sometimes we want to be a member because a member gives us some rights and we want to be able to be involved. Sometimes it's just, we want to maybe it's a donation charity just so it supports the activity. We want to do that. The flip side, when you look at an enterprise company, is that we have different means of getting money. We have corporate charity components that we can bring money into an organization that help out, or it's OpEx. The hosting event this week came from Dave Ward's OpEx, right? And we run fiscal quarters and years, and we've got to work within that. And that's one guy because we had one good sponsor. We also have 7 different business groups that may have an interest. We have 100 or some odd people that show up here from different groups across Cisco that we can get money from. So it's a bit of a challenge that we do it, how we get the money, how it gets channeled to the right folks, and what the interest is of people at Cisco and what they want to get the value out of it. So if all those things are in consideration, based on where you started from, I think you're on the right track. But the enterprises, we do have a challenge in getting the money, having the money, and continuing being representative for it. We're full representative of IETF and ISOC across the whole, and we have different interests across the company. Thanks.
I'm Richard Barnes. I work for Cisco, but I have no insights as to how Cisco does and makes any of these decisions. So I'm glad Damien was in front of me in line. I wanted to get up here to push back on this kind of business unit framing that Ted and Yone brought up. I think it is true that restructuring some things internally in this IASA ++ sort of framing can add some incremental degrees of clarity, can clarify certain things about how the administrative activities are run themselves. What I don't think it can really clarify is kind of these some of these transparency objectives, in terms of providing the IETF community more direct control. I mean, as long as the administrative organization, the administrative resources remain under the direct control of ISOC, whether that's as a relatively walled off business unit or something more nebulous. Good. As long as we have that, the ultimate decision makers will be the ISOC organization and their management and their board, which the IETF has some influence over, but that's pretty attenuated control. So I think, as Andrew put it a few moments ago, the real question is here: to what degree does the IETF want to have actual control and stand up and manage their administrative activities versus continuing to be a ward of some other organization?
So hi there, Glenn Dean from Comcast NBC Universal. So I'm up here, on 2 points. Number one is the financing model of our contribution. So we are both platinum members. So we're both platinum members of ISOC, and we are platinum members of ISOC because we value what ISOC does, and we understand what it does as a distinct entity from an IETF. And we are also global hosts of the IETF. And I'll tell you, in my budget, where I budget for this expense every year, I have 2 line items. They're different line items. They're not one, they're 2. So we figured it out. We see the difference between the 2. That said, it would not be hard for people that we are trying to attract as new sponsors to have a great deal of confusion between the two and who I'm dealing with. If I'm talking to people in this room, you already all get it. We need more funding sources, however, and they're out there and they're not in this room and they don't necessarily understand it. So I think simplifying it has a lot of benefits for our future as IETF and even for ISOC. So that's on the funding side. My view on how you structure this stuff, however, is that instead of worrying about necessarily the funding, how the money flows in as the primary driver for how you structure it, you first should figure out, and this is actually very good, the way you've broken this out, Leslie, is to figure out what the problems are that we have to deal organizationally with, operationally and day-to-day stuff, how to make that run smoothly, how to structure it to be smoothly. Then the follow on from there is, and the driver for that is essentially, how do you spend the money? How do you enter a contract? How do you buy a thing? How do you make choices? How do you manage? Figure that out. Figure what you need to do organizationally to make that work really well. Then worry about how you draw the money and whether it's a separate entity or it's a funding contribution or whatever. But figure out what we need as a management team first, and what that structure looks like, in my view.
Alyssa Cooper. So Glenn actually said one of the things that I wanted to say, which was, it's glorious to hear that after 8 or 10 years, Ericsson and Cisco have figured out the difference between ISOC and the IETF. But who are the sponsors of the future, and why should we burden all of those conversations with this lack of clarity? And I got up here to say that because I have been shocked at the amount of time that, as IETF chair, I have had to spend on sponsorship-related issues. I think maybe you gave me a heads up about this, but I was still shocked. And a lot of that has to do with the changing landscape of our funders, and the fact that there's this additional barrier at the beginning of every conversation with one of them who are not here. I have found to be kind of taxing. It takes up a lot of time to try and draw out those distinctions. I also wanted to respond to something that Joe Abley said about the recent changes in the approach as far as the sponsorship fundraising goes. Those came about because Leslie and I and Ray took the initiative to find Joe Abley and ask him to come help and change the approach. And again, that is time that is taken away from volunteers in the IETF community who are supposed to be busy doing their technical work, and instead was spent doing that. So that is something that I think also is one of the drivers around this. Is not we shouldn't sit back and say, oh, this is all fixed because we've taken these little baby steps. That we took those baby steps under by putting in some amount of effort, which isn't really accounted for anywhere within the way that we currently structure the administration and the fundraising. And I think that's important to keep in mind.
Ted Hardy, I'm cursed with a very visual imagination. So when people kept saying the ward of ISOC, I couldn't help thinking of Dick Grayson, Ward, Bruce Wayne, and now I've been picturing Gonzalo in a purple cowl and Alyssa in a very, very bright yellow cape. It's not really working now. I wanted to get back to that point though, and that's, I think, something that Andrew has a very persuasive manner, but I think we disagree on this. I think in every one of these proposals, we are ceasing to be a ward of ISOC. The difference is in one of these, we're moving from a dependent relationship to a partnership. And we are asking, hey, you have funded us, but now recognize that we need to be able to operate independently as part of a partnership. So this isn't a ward relationship. This is saying in IASA++, this relationship is the one that's of two partners moving forward to do their different things to meet the common goal of making the internet work better. In the subsidiary relationship, maybe we decide that the right way to make that happen is to say, okay, this is formerly a ward relationship, but now you're going to go out and move out on your own, and I may subsidize your apartment, but you're going to do your own thing. But I think that each of these is a reorganization for both elements of what's currently one organization. And I keep hearing people say, you know, the IETF and ISOC as if they were two organizations. And it seems like a very large part of this community never really internalized the fact that we are part of ISOC and have been for 10 years. And all right, so various people are giving me different decades here. We're going to sit down over a CNRA flavored cup of coffee sometime and discuss this further. And Bob Kahn will haunt our discussion, or maybe we'll just call him up. I don't know. But I think that the important point here is all of these are intended to make us no longer a ward of ISOC. And it really is in partnership with ISOC. The very first thing we need to do is, whether it's partners or moving into the other relationship, is work with ISOC to see which one of these things works best for them. The other part of us, right? And I think that what I'm hearing so far is, especially for the fundraising reason, it actually gets clearer for both missions, both ways of exercising this joint mission, if we go to something like a subsidiary model. But I think that we have to look at all of these as us stepping up to the plate and being the adults in the room in any one of these, and understanding it requires a reorganization of ISOC, whether it's just our part of ISOC or other parts of ISOC as well, in all three of these, and make that adjustment as a partner.
So Jonas Hoinen again at the microphone, and I think that I agree with most what Ted said. It's not the legal organization; it's the organization. How does IETF want to do the administration, and how does that work with ISOC the best way? And this means that, and I might have said it more in a more confused manner before, but the thing is, we have to step up anyways, regardless what is the legal model. And that is the kind of like clear thing. That is the important thing. There are ways of doing this inside ISOC or outside ISOC. That's a choice that has to be made, but there are ways of doing it. But the important thing is that there's a model where IETF gets that done, what it needs to be, what needs to get done. It has some way of basically organizing that. It has a way of directing that. We can then look at how that is the best way is done legally after we have that model. I mean, like, I've seen now different organizations doing things differently, where first there are, so just in my experience, for instance, in Linux Foundation, there are organizations in Linux Foundations that are separate legal entities that work within the umbrella of Linux Foundation. There are organizations that's, for instance, OPNFV, the Open Platform for NFV is one like that. There are organizations like Open Network Automation Platform, which is actually a part of Linux Foundation, but it still has a governing board. It still has its own own finances and has its own budget and the kind of like independence over the mother organization there. We can do either or here as well. But the important thing is, of course, that, and I thought that was already given, that we understand that there are changes that have to be made. The IETF needs more independence and more kind of like control over its resources. But how to organize that, I think it's a minor point.
Jonna, could just for my edification, I'm sorry, do you want to go?
Well, you go first now.
Well, I was just as a clarification. I mean, is there any like specific criteria you might identify as like what crosses the line from as a plus to subsidiary? Like what, is there any condition you'd point to that said that's when that would be necessary?
No, I don't have anything like that in mind. I think that the thing is that, and I don't think that those are that different.
That's what I'm getting from it. That's kind of why I'm asking.
Yeah, it's kind of like it's still inside, it's a separate legal entity, but it's still a subsidiary of ISOC. So if it's a legal entity or not, that's not that different. So I don't think that there is really a boundary. It's just a kind of like, it's most probably more mental. it looks more separate if it's a subsidiary, and maybe it's easier to explain to people. I don't know.
Is that a good thing? Yeah.
Depends. I to be honest, I don't care.
So part of what I'm hearing in what you said and what some of the previous speakers have said, and I'll say it out loud just so people can tell me if I've got it wrong. I think that in part what we have achieved so far is articulating where the stresses and strains are in the current administrative reality of the IETF. It would be good to establish in this room whether or not people have allergic reactions to particular outcomes on this continuum. And apart from that, it's a question of getting together with ISOC and saying what works best for all of us.
Okay, I paused in case someone wanted to scream at you, but they didn't. Brian Carpenter again. I originally got up to react to something Richard Barnes said, but actually all the other speakers in front of me have confirmed that I need to say this. The essential characteristic of the new model, and I don't care whether the thing is called an oversight committee or a board or a subsidiary board or what it's called, it needs to do oversight, right? We've got to up-level where we put our stakeholder effort, viewing the IETF as the stakeholder, right, to the point where we are overseeing things happening automatically in the works that we want to happen. We should say what we want to happen, and we should oversee the fact that they do happen. And I think, and you know, again, I'm guilty, you're guilty, everybody who served in the IAOC is guilty of not implementing that aspect of BCP 101, right? And I actually don't care very much about the formal structure in the end, as long as we actually get to that position, you know, where the oversight is being performed as oversight and the work is being performed as work, and the two don't get melded and mixed up in the way they seem to be at the moment.
Yeah, I guess I agree with that, and just wanted to add that I think to the point of you know, the actual organization of substance, or us stepping up, or the oversight and all of that being the main thing, and that's true. There are some things, however, that where the organizational structure does matter. So I believe, like some of the examples that Leslie gave us do point to, like, you know, being able to do some things easier when you have clearly defined organizational boundary. And I would also like to argue that if you use structures that you can easily explain to other people, and that's a benefit, like, you know, traditional organizational structures.
So Lucy Lynch, and I'm sad that my feedback didn't get incorporated, because I feel like the weakest parts of this proposal are the oversight portion and the professionalization portion around staff and the cultural effects of that, both of which I think are not very clearly understood. And I think, reflecting on what both Wendy and Glenn said, if you go back to sort of the first principles of what you were trying to solve here, and your overloading of roles in the current staffing of the IAOC, the overloading of the relationship with ISOC around things like contracting and the funding relationship, those things, and you begin to pull those apart and solve for those, you need to keep in mind that every time you do that, you change the culture, and you change, as those governance structures come in, the descriptions of boards and advisory boards and whatever, that can be distancing. And professionalization of staff, if it moves too quickly, and delegation of authority moves too quickly, can be distancing as well for a community that's been very hands-on in how they manage themselves. So I'm concerned about those aspects of the proposals overall. I think the first two models can work. I think the third model, as Wendy says, presents enormous challenges, and we would have to be very careful.
This is Andrew Sullivan. I think that Ted and I are actually more in agreement than we might think. But I want to press a little bit on some of the analogy that Ted proposed to the list, because I think that it's important. Right, all analogies are in some sense false. Otherwise, they wouldn't be analogies. They'd be identities. And the thing about the line of business model versus the subsidiary model is that in the line of business, right, all of the people who are in the line of business formally are employed by the larger corporation. I'm part of a line of business, but Oracle pays me, and I have a legal responsibility to Oracle. And the problem with our current line of business approach to this, or an IASA double plus line of business approach, is that we don't actually have a mechanism by which we make that kind of relationship. Now, maybe we could invent one, and then IASA plus plus would be a way to do that. But at the moment, some of the problems that Leslie had in her in the chart that's up here are literally just legal problems that you can't get around because we don't have this kind of legal relationship between the IOC and the organization of which it is a part. You're quite correct about that, right? The IETF is part of ISOC, but we don't have the legal home in the sense that the IOC members are not part of the legal organization because this activity isn't sort of legally constituted. And so if we change that sort of relationship, then the members of the oversight board or whatever then have this legal relationship to the organization because they're board members. And I think that fact, I mean, maybe that's too scary. It's got these implications for membership, who could possibly stand for it, because a lot of companies have rules about whether you can be on boards and all the rest. But I think that is an important difference between the models that we ought to attend to in thinking about whether growing up by just becoming a more partnership-like activity of this larger organization is something that actually meets the needs that we have. And I think that this list of issues is an example of where some of those are just never going to be possible unless you set up some legal distinctions that we don't currently have.
Thank you. Tobias Gondrom. I just wanted to add some context to some of the things that I heard before, because the term board kind of implies that the other person tells you what to do in some cases, and I didn't feel very comfortable with that word, because to share some of my experiences in the IOC, I had at no point the perception that that ISOC would tell the IOC what to do. In fact, it was always the other way around. It was always IOC says this and ISOC always executed on this. There was no discussion about this. And in fact, at least that's my experience as former IOC chair and as like now 3.5 years member. So this term board, I think, is a little bit misleading. And if you have the feeling that ISOC is sitting somewhere in the background controlling the IOC, that is not my not my experience at all. I think it leads a little bit to what Brian said. Maybe there's a lack on our side actually to step up and fill that gap. That ISOC is basically always accepting what the IOC is saying, but the IOC may not fulfill all the oversight it should. For example, when it comes to the money, like it's very easy for us because ISOC always fills the gap. So budget control is maybe not such an intrinsic need or burning problem. However, we have seen our costs explode and our income not exactly match that. But that's just one of the things. So I just wanted to balance that thought that we are like controlled by ISOC in what we are doing. I don't think we are.
Oh, hi, Bob Hinden. So first of all, for background, I've been the chair of the IOC and I've been chair of the ISOC board, not at the same time, thankfully. So I have some view of this from both sides, if we can describe it that way. And I mean, I still characterize the relationship between ISOC and the IETF as sort of a win-win for both organizations. We both get a lot out of it. But I can certainly see that there are a number of tensions and things that need to be the relationship, the interface needs to be a lot clearer defined, because there's obviously been friction in recent times. on the spectrum of, where we are now, IASA++, subsidiary or independent, I lean, I don't think independent is, I don't see how we get there. And I think as long as we're largely dependent on ISOC for revenue, well, you're not really independent anyway, because if ISOC no longer has money to support the IETF, then, it's like being independent isn't such a good thing. So I don't see that as a practical choice. I think we're probably looking for something between IASA++ and what's called subsidiary, but I don't think it's actually, I think it's supporting organization is maybe a better word for this. So I think it's somewhere along there a line. I know, I was thinking, what are the differences? Well, at some point there's a difference when you have to file your own tax return, then you're not part of the other organization anymore. I worry that, Alyssa said earlier that she was surprised how much time she's spending on sponsorship stuff. And it seems to me that if we want to become more independent, the IETF leadership is going to spend even more time on things like that and less on the technical work. And because I don't think you can have it both ways. I don't think you can have staff who have the same viewpoints as the people who are involved in the actual technical work. I think that's some of the tension when ISOC was trying to do fundraising, because they can't speak in the same way that, the leaders of, our leadership groups can. And so, I think we have this desire to somehow have somebody else do that, but have it be perfect. And I don't think we get that. So again, I lean sort of think we should try to do as little as possible to significantly improve the relationship. I'm not quite sure if that requires, a separate organization or can be done in the ISOC structure, but I think that's the space we should be spending time to figure out.
This is Barry Leba. I'm going to make an analogy to what Andrew said. And I think I largely agree with Bob. Leslie has a bunch of things laid out here on the right that are oddities from the ISOC perspective. If Kathy has an issue with signing contracts that we create, if ISOC's IT has issues with the difference in IT arrangements, if we have a problem with ISOC formally being the ones to hire the IAD, even though we make the decision and do the performance evaluations, let's do whatever we need to do to fix those. But let's minimize the separation from ISOC. Bob called it a win-win. More specifically, ISOC gives us connection to development and outreach and governance and that sort of thing. We give ISOC a better connection to the technical world. And I think that benefits both organizations. So I lean more toward the IASA++, possibly somewhere in between that and the next version, and way away from complete separation.
If I can just quickly respond just a little bit to that or do a follow-up. I think, with my experience as IETF chair, I think the issue is that if you see, you have to handle a task, whether it's, fundraising or whatever, or buying software or managing your employees that actually do the work. That can be done in obviously multiple different ways. And so the choices that you have is, can you organize that in the sort of most efficient sense so that you have, the need to do less coordination and you have a, closer knit team and then you execute more efficiently. And of course that does mean that you have to spend some time doing that reorg. Or you live with, constraints that are in the current model. And that's the trade-off. And at least from my perspective, some reorg, some rethinking of how these pieces fit together is useful, because then the long-term benefit is that you actually get things running more smoothly because you have less parties to negotiate a particular contract, for instance. So before I was talking about ISOC's expectations on this, and I had made a comment on the list, but I'll make it here again. And I think Bob phrased it very well as a win-win scenario or situation or relationship. So the fact that, I mean, ISOC's technical work actually gets a lot of credibility from being basically the home of the IETF or whatever you want to call it. So no matter what we do, I think we make, or well, it's really up to the IETF community, but if the IETF community values that type of technical work that very often involves the promotion of IETF technologies, I think it's important that the connection is clear somehow. So in both directions. And then a second comment unrelated to that, which is about funding. I mean, I've made this comment in the sponsorship committee, but we're talking about funding here for several times, so I'll make it here as well. Some of the problems that you have with the channeling of money to the IETF that people complain about, like, they are members of ISAC, but they really want to support the IETF, is not going away regardless of what, structure you take. Because, and Tobias mentioned that as well, I have mentioned that many times, I think, all the global host, which is like when I actually became the ISOC chair and I went to talk to people that wanted to get money, their answer was like, but if I give money to the IETF, at the end of the day, really, I'm giving money to the other ISOC, activities, because ISOC is going to pay whatever the IETF wants. So then it makes no difference if I get 1 million here or not. That's something that is not fair, actually, but just something that, something positive for the IETF may become actually something negative because some sponsors are not willing to give money to the IETF. So this is something to keep in mind, and you're not going to solve it with structure. You can solve it with, fixed budgets or something like that, but not really with structure.
I think the slight pushback on that is, again, coming back to the ability to message to people and for people who aren't sitting in this room to understand what the relationship is.
Economically, it's true, right?
Right.
If
It doesn't make any difference in practical terms, but from a visibility or an explanation point of view, there's a...
We agree on that. Yeah.
So, Kathy Brown, I thought I've listened, I guess, about 3 of these meetings now, and I think it's really been enormously healthy, very healthy. I want to just echo what I think some of you said, that in no way did I ever understand, or I hope any of us ever act that that the IETF is a ward of ISAC. Indeed, it's always been a notion of a partnership, and I think we've tried to work it that way. So I think what's important about, and I and my partners in the IETF and the IAB have, and it's been pretty cool experience actually working through the different perspectives on the various roles we take in this ecosystem. And so I think we stay there and we start with that and we don't go away from that, because there's a deep value here about who we are as, I always call us cousins of sorts that have to work out the stuff when we get to dinner once a year. But it usually works out if we work on it a bit. But I see 3 things that I think are important, and I think Yari and Alyssa and others have raised it. One, there is a governance issue that's a legal issue, and it's the one that when people say, "Oh, it's Kathy about signing the contract," it's not about Kathy signing the contract. I can sign the contract. The problem is that ISOC has a legal responsibility and a fiduciary duty for a lot of legal matters that are actually of the nature of the IETF. And so as the chief executive officer of ISOC, I'm supposed to worry about that. It's what you pay me to do. Is there an issue that we want to make sure that the clarity as to who is responsible for what gets sorted? And the way we are set up now, ISOC is responsible, legally liable for many things that, in fact, second point of governance, we have little or no control over, nor do we exercise it. So ISOC has a whole list of policies. Personnel policies are one of them. Privacy policies are another. Whether you can walk across the border with your laptop full of ISOC data is another. I could list these things for you that are our policies that do not apply to you or don't seem to apply to you because that's not the way we operate. But one, it's a lack of clarity as to how that should operate. So there's kind of this governance issue. Then there's just a plain operational issue. Which way causes more inefficiencies? I'm a little bit here with Yari. I'm not sure the way we do it causes more inefficiencies than if it was a simpler structure that said, you know, your IOC or your oversight committee or whoever that is has authority to make that decision and final sign off. This way you have to go through that, and then sometimes it's kind of laughable. We're sitting at the IOC. I said, well, am I talking about myself now as a member of this committee, or is it because I'm going to sign the check, or because, right? So there's a layer of kind of stuff here that maybe gets cleared up. So governance, then operation, and then culture. And I agree, by the way, that this culture issue, and Lucy's right. You could do this and make it all horrible and everybody isn't talking to each other anymore and you have processes and procedures. And I think one could guard against that, and I think one should. And the other piece is this relationship between the two organizations, which is as important to ISOC as it is to IETF. It is very important to ISOC that we are the home of the IETF. When I explain that to people, I was just on there playing with a fellow saying, why are you coming to Singapore? Well, I'm going to the IETF meeting. Well, who are they to you? Oh, want to hear? It's very cool. Here's what happens. And here's what's blah, blah, blah. Oh, IPv6, we're running out of numbers. Is that something you care about? Oh, yeah, I'm going to have dinner with the guy who was on the team that, you know, figured out the code. This is part of our DNA as well. So there's no notion that we somehow shouldn't keep this together, but we should keep it together, respecting the culture, getting the operational things in order, and it seems to me finally getting these governance things sorted out so that there shouldn't be a doubt about this stuff. If I'm not sure because we haven't gone this far to look at it. Does a subsidiary, or the language used here, and a 501c3, for instance, supporting organization, give you or the other organization the ability to set up its own policies? I believe the answer is yes. We have to sort this, but I believe the answer is yes. That means it's okay if ISOC wants to have this set of things and you want to have this. We don't have a problem then. It's done. Do you have signing authority for something over $100,000? Very easy in a subsidiary. The answer is yes. Now, we could go down the list and say, well, you could do this in a business unit too, but it's just not as clear. So I know I'm not supposed to have a point of view, but you could tell I do. My point of view is I would hate that. I would hate that last option. I would hate that. But I do believe that you're landing somewhere between this plus and the subsidiary. And I'm with John on this. Why don't we sit down and figure it out? Does it help solve the problem or not? And if it solves the problem, at what cost would it be to do that? And then can we work out the money issues so that all becomes kind of beside the point? That's kind of the way I'm looking at it. Okay.
Okay, I see Ecker there, and I think with that, or Sean, Sean, if you want to be on too, okay.
Would you like to be next?
I won't let the ISOC treasurer not speak on this.
So we've always said we said subsidiary a bunch, and it's always confusing me. I think the correct term is supporting organization, and you can go to the IRS and read supporting organization requirements and types. There's 3 types. So one is there's essentially direct control of the board of once it's on the other. There's a second one, which I can't remember the difference. The second one is like essentially kind of separate, but you still have to have some agreements. So you can do all of those things. At some point, I'm not a lawyer. I'm also not a tax lawyer. We should probably get somebody who actually gets paid to do that to make sure it'll all work. Maybe now wasn't the time, but maybe we're getting close.
So I except for my sort of earlier hat thing, I'm mostly sitting and listening. I've been here a long time now, both in this room and at IETF, and and I've seen a lot of beauty contests, and I sort of expected we were going to get in here and hum on A, B, or C, and we can still do that if people really want to. But what I've heard a bunch of people say is that these are not sharp things, and in fact it's not entirely clear what a subsidiary actually is. And Sean points out we have a bunch of options and we need some lawyers. But I also hear people who generally think that and I know not everybody thinks this, but that some things are the locus of some set of independence with some careful agreements between that thing, which probably has some legal structure in ISOC, are good things. So rather, I mean, and I liked what Kathy just said about, like, maybe we could get some people in a room and actually try to hammer out exactly what works best for the two organizations. And like, so rather than sort of like, try to like hum on like A, B, or C, and, then have like that group have marching orders to try to make A, B, or C. I wonder if we have like enough, if we I don't pretend to be smart enough to phrase this, but maybe John can, because he's good at these kinds of things. Is there some way to say, like, are people generally comfortable with something in the general locus of like not complete separation, but not the thing we have now, and with some legal like distinction, and allowing chartering some subgroup to go figure that out and come back with a recommendation that actually makes ISOC and that subgroup happy?
And just to emphasize your last point, I think the very important part is, and then come back, because I'm not a fan of signing blank checks as an individual.
Nor am I, and I would expect anything. I guess the reason I suggested that is because, otherwise what we're going to do is we're going to basically say, well, you have some marching orders, and then you'll still have to come back anyway. And so given that I think people are mostly converging on something, like, we feel comfortable with that, with like humming on that rather than trying to like do a beauty contest and resolve things.
I think that's wise counsel. Lucy?
Lucy Lynch. So I'm fine with that as a solution to a part of the problem set that you're working on. I don't think that solves the overloading issue on internal leadership and the structure of the IAOC. And I don't think that solves the professionalization and staffing and cultural problem. So taking that as an element to solve the partnership problem sounds great, but it's only a piece of the problem.
Alyssa, I think, yeah. That might be your cue.
Yeah. So on that point, actually, that's what I've been sitting there thinking about most of the time. Because there is a bit of a chicken and egg here. That's how I feel about it, which is to say, there's some things that you can do under one or two of these options that you can't do under other ones, even from a process perspective. If we are going to, add some staff or, create a department within ISOC, there's like a different set of lawyers. You don't need nonprofit incorporation lawyers if that's what you're going to do. So I feel like, although there does seem to be a lot gelling in this room, I would like to take a few hums about the options as presented in the draft to try and get a sense of what are the right next steps from a process perspective. How do we shape this teamwork that we're going to go off and do? How do we shape the work that we're going to go off and do in the IETF that is reflective of the work with ISOC? So I'd like to kind of get a sense of that, even though I know that not everybody is bought into whether that's the right next set of questions. Can you give me my next slide, please? And so I think what we're looking for here with the hums that I'm going to attempt to take are general preferences, right? So I think the discussion today reveals that there are many, many details about each of the options as presented in the draft that will need to be worked out. And what I've been thinking about in terms of the process for that is that if we get a sense in the room today, at least as maybe even just the distinction between independent versus something in the other space, or do we actually need legal entity versus not legal entity? If we can get a little bit of clarity about that today based off of these hums, then we can try to, I'm committing to try to draft a working group charter that reflects that sense in terms of the scoping of what IETF documents will need to be updated in order to carry us forward in that direction. And then in parallel with that, start this joint work between the ISOC board and some subset of the IETF leadership and community to start working through some of the details and basically have a conversation between those two tracks until we feel like the documents in the IETF reflect the kind of more legal work that would need to be done by the team and vice versa, and we're all in sync. So that's kind of the process that I'm envisioning going forward. It's a bit of a novel thing. Obviously, it's not the way that we normally would charter a working group and also stand up this other thing, but it sounds like there's support in the room for having something along those lines. So with that said about the process, we need some direction to figure out where are we going to take that process. So next slide, please. So I think just the first question, you know, in the last session in Prague, I think some people felt like we hadn't really fleshed out some of this discussion enough. We didn't understand the problem well enough, and so on and so forth. So I first just wanted to get a sense of the room, whether people feel like they have enough information to then express a preference along the spectrum that we've been discussing. So there's going to be two questions. One is if you feel like you have enough information, and the other one is if you don't. So if you feel like you have enough information to express a general preference about what you think is the best path forward for IASA 2.0, please hum now. And if you feel that you do not have enough information to express a general preference about what you think is the best path forward for IASA 2.0, please hum now. Okay, so I think the rough consensus is that people have enough information, but also happy to work with you guys to get more information that you need if there's things that we can do from a factual perspective. Okay, so let's proceed to the next one. So 4 questions here, reflective again of the options as they were laid out in the draft, acknowledging that, you know, all this discussion we've had, that these are really kind of points along a spectrum. They don't demarcate anything very, very specific right now, but you get a general sense of what the differences are between them. So would like to understand the sense of the room on these. So the first question is, if you believe that the IASA++ option is the best path forward, please hum now. If you believe the ISOC subsidiary option is the best path forward, please hum now. If you believe the independent organization option is the best path forward, please hum now. And if you do not believe that any of the options are suitable, please hum now. Okay. Can I just recap really quick what I heard? Or do you want to speak before I do that?
I'd like a hum on not enough information available on IASA 2.0 as opposed to a renegotiation of the relationship with ISOC, which is a different thing.
Was that not the first hum, Lucy?
No.
Can you stay there for a second? Sorry, just so. Can we go back to 2? Can we just go back to 2 so we can reflect what happened in the hum, and then we'll come back to Lucy. Okay. So what I heard probably the loudest hum for B, but a significant portion of the room supporting A, no support at all for C, and in Jabber. Okay, thank you. And a quiet hum for D. So to me, it sounds like the room is somewhere in the A-B range. Can you say what you said again? I didn't quite understand.
I will say what I said again.
Closer to the mic.
From the discussion in the room today, I believe that there is greater clarity on how we want to move forward with negotiating the ongoing partnership with ISOC. But that's only one component of IASA 2.0, and that includes professionalization, it includes changes in staffing and governance. There were a lot of other things in there that didn't get substantive discussion, and I don't think we have enough information to move forward with a direction on IASA 2.0 altogether. I think we have enough information to move forward on renegotiating the partnership, which is a piece of the problem.
Okay, I understand now. Thank you.
This is Pete. The problem I had going through this, trying to pick one or hum, it seems to me there are specific issues that I care about here. Like Kathy was talking about the legal structure making it impossible to do certain things, right? That it because of her fiduciary responsibilities, because of ISOC's board members' fiduciary responsibilities, they have to do it a certain way if we pick one or the other. So, for instance, if we could come up with some legal structure, some way to have IAOC have direct employment control over the IAD and still be an A, I'd be okay with A, but the sound of what I was hearing was that's not literally legally possible. And in which case I'm either for B or for C, and more likely for B. It seems to me that we've got more worry about what we want the results to be than the particular structure we choose.
Well, and I do think, Pete, that Alyssa described this as a continuum, right? And definitely as general preferences. And we do know, the thing Sean was just saying to me about what the different states being a subsidiary, right? That was new information to me, right? So, I mean, we're going to have to get much more narrow into what's possible with all these options along that continuum.
But there was an awfully loud, although not most, there was an awfully loud hum for A, where if the result is we can't have A and have IAOC give employment instructions, are all of the A people still okay with A? Or,
Yeah,
I mean,
so-
that doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, I think, going back to, I think it was Yari's last slide, I think the design team, at least as far as I understand, and certainly myself, we've been trying to kind of narrow in on a scoping of this that is concrete enough that we can go off and try to flesh out a bunch of the details. I think maybe what I'm hearing from you and from Lucy is that the joint work that needs to be done between us and the ISOC Board of Trustees maybe needs to flesh out multiple options of those, as opposed to trying to work within what we have characterized as an option, which I think is probably doable, but is an even bigger task for before we come back to the IETF community. And so I guess I had the sense that we wanted to do more work in the community first or in parallel, but it sounds like what you guys are saying is do more work together with the ISOC board, which is not really IETF, the IETF working group type work, and then come back. Do you think that gets what you were saying, Pete?
I think so. I would want an answer to a series of legal questions before I could tell you what I want the outcome to look like.
Okay.
I don't know if that requires like lots of background work between the ISOC board and IETF leadership, or that just requires a laying out of some legal principles and some structures that work and don't work for certain scenarios, and then do that as part of the chartering process. That might be okay.
Leslie Daigle, I don't want us to have to prove the right path for an outcome before we can take a step forward. But repeating something I said earlier, I think that I'm hearing that an important part of the next step is to understand better, to collect requirements from the ISOC perspective before we could even make a proposal for what's feasible going forward. So at this point in time, I don't think we should rat hole terribly on whether it's 2A or 2B going forward. I think that we can collect from this session, a deeper sense of what people feel about the relationship, and then go and collect some more requirements before we come back and try to figure out which way we're going. I think that's what we have to do. I don't think we can discuss it further than that with the data that we have in the room today. And I think in part what I hear and what Lucy is saying is that this may be necessary, it's not sufficient. I think that it's probably the case that we don't yet have our heads enough in the space of understanding how to solve some of the other, governance problems to even, catch up to there. So that's how I think this is playing out.
And
Okay.
by the way,
So-
the mic lines have to be closed to this point. Plenty of people.
But okay, so that is helpful. Thank you. What I would like maybe other people who are in the queue to speak to, or at least respond to, is my understanding of the process that is behind that, which again is, you know, some small number of people in the IETF leadership going off and working with ISOC and potentially with legal teams to try and flesh those out. It is not chartering a working group. That will be sometime in the future after that initial piece of work gets done. Yes? Okay. If other people have opinions about that in the queue, that would be helpful to understand.
Harald Alvestrand. Humming is great for taking options off the table. It's and I thank you for doing this. This is good because we now know that C is off the table. I liked the remark earlier that the difference between A and B in the immediate sense is which lawyers do you call for advice? So I think we have a strong mandate to flesh out B to the point that we know what the consequences of taking B are, in the sense that Pete referred to. Keeping an eye out for what would happen if we try to A is good, but not required, unless we figure out that B doesn't work. So I believe that we have a way forward, and I'm happy to see that we're exploring it. And I'm looking forward to the next set of. These are the solutions that are possible given that this way is taken, and then we decide whether we take the way.
Stephen Farrell. So I got to kind of agree with Lucy. I think, you know, while I think the sense of today that we're somewhere between A and B is entirely reasonable, and figuring out the consequences with which lawyers and so on is also reasonable. There's a bunch of things to do with the whole IASA or IASA 2.0 that I think should be worked on in parallel, unless we want to be doing this for 3 or 4 years. So I'm not supporting the idea of first figuring out where we are between A and B before anything else happens. If that was what you were proposing, and it kind of sounded like that to me.
No, what I was saying was that I actually think these things are intimately related. So I guess I just disagree with Lucy. I think, you know, essentially asking the current NomCom structure, the current way that we appoint the IEOC to just like have a different role vis-a-vis a larger set of people who work for ISOC in a slightly different capacity is like, those things are very much bound up, right? Like, okay, you added more staff, you professionalized within ISOC, but you kept the oversight structure the same. Whereas, like, if you set up a subsidiary, it needs to have a board, and we need to figure out what the oversight looks like. And so, like, those things are bound up together. And so, I'm proposing. I guess what I thought I was hearing was that people want us to go off and articulate in more detail the staffing aspects and the professionalization aspects and the governance aspects along the continuum between A and B. We want to get some professional advice about that, and we want to talk to ISOC about what they think about that, and we want to come back with a suite of options that's fleshed out in across that whole comprehensive set of questions.
So that would be my expectation, is that you work all the pieces of the process. And my objection here was the saying, go forward with an option when we've only really discussed one piece of the problem.
And just for information, I still am not sure I agree, because I think there's a whole bunch of the set of problems that we covered earlier that while you can't finalize them, you can still do some work on things like improving transparency or figuring out, you know, roughly how many people might be needed to professionalize. So I think there's a bunch of things that could be progressed while also progressing this kind of organizational and governance issue.
Okay.
Ted Hardy speaking. And astonishingly, I came up to talk to the point you later asked us to address when we were in line. Unbelievable. And that's on the question of how the charter should work. And I strongly believe that we should not wait until we've gotten a huge way down any particular road with the right set of lawyers to start the chartering process, because I believe the chartering process is an important part of getting buy-in from the larger community that didn't make time for this meeting in this room to agree with us that this is something that we're going to move forward with. And I think that we don't want to wait to put that before them until we have documents in last call, that we do that through the mechanism of chartering a way forward. And I think that that means that right now that charter would say we're going to explore something between 2A and 2B. Probably for the purposes of a charter, I would write it as 2B, an ISOC supporting organization, and then use that chartering to get further input from the community. And I think, yeah, you probably do need to talk to a lawyer first to make sure that you're using the right language when you say ISOC supporting organization versus subsidiary versus something else. And thank you for the people in the chatting room who put various tax code implications in there for me to read. That made my head hurt. Thank you. But the chartering is an important part of getting community buy-in, and I don't think it should wait.
I guess I don't have a strong feeling about whether we should charter now or charter later. But I did want to sort of second what Harold said. I don't want to see I just spent like 9 months of my life doing this and like coming back with a suite of options, and I don't want to be like 6 months in and have like, oh, here's another suite of options which like Chris has to select. Like I think we heard like a general direction that like, you know, that we should be going in, and we should be chartering a set of people to like negotiate in that direction, not to come back with like a whole array of things we had to run a beauty contest between. So I think I liked what you said at the beginning. I didn't like quite so much what you said when they should kind of come back with a suite. I think we should be like, let us try to make one thing work, and if that thing cannot be made to work, we have a reserve plan, but not like a menu.
Hi, Sean Turner. I think these hums were incredibly helpful because, like Harold said, like it's between 2A and 2B, and that's great. Let's not complicate it too much. I think we can move forward. We can do things in parallel. We can make sure that we cover all three of the things that Lucy talked about. Let's do it. If we need to know the lawyer for the tax thing, we got that guy. I called him on the carpet, put him on the phone. I'm like, if we go to court, let me see your face because I'm going to point at you. Those kind of things. That we can work through all that stuff. It's fairly quick. I think that we could get the small set of leadership skill people in the room. Many of them live in Washington, D.C. We could do it in an afternoon probably and go through some of this stuff. I don't think it's terribly that hard that we could get together and flesh out a possible way forward between 2A and 2B and figuring out what, you know, from the IETF perspective and from the ISOC perspective, like what the kind of rough points are. I think we could do that. I don't think we need to take 3 years to do this because it's going to suck the life out of many of us. Thank you.
Jonas Honinen, and yeah, first of all, I want to thank you also that we've taken away the 2C now and we have a little bit more clearer path forward. But what I would actually say is a little bit different than some other people have said. So what I would want to do is basically to charter and working group and work on the governance model. I think that from the governance model, plus some requirements that we've heard from Kathy, or maybe that can be written down as more kind of like official thing or more structured thing, we can figure out which one is better, 2A, 2B. We can then ask the lawyers to say that this is what we want, go implement it, and propose which one is better or what, something in between those. There are two ways of using lawyers. One is that we can go to lawyers and say, here's a bunch of money, why don't you propose as a structure? We don't really know what we want, but why don't you propose as a structure? That's one way, and they will propose as a structure, and it might be good. Other way is saying, we have this model, why don't you implement that for us? And I believe in the latter model more, and I think that would need basically having the governance model written down before we go for legal advice.
Can you give an example of a model? Like, just pretend like you have to write the document that has the model in it. Give an example of a model that you would write down.
Well, I mean, like, if you say basically that you need an oversight organization that has the possibility to directly direct the staff, give the direction, fire and hire that person, has the possibility to run, has some budget, has the possibility to control that within that budget directly, has the possibility to do contracts in way or form or another. That is a governance model, for instance. And then the kind of like how to implement that. Well, it might be a corporate board. It might be so often subsidiary or support organization or affiliate, whatever you want to call it, or whatever is the right way of calling it. Or it might be something else. But the thing is, the important thing is, what do we want this organization? What is the governance model? What do we want it to do? And then we can implement it legally. And it's most probably something between A and B. And then comes the kind of like requirements in that Kathy says, like, well, ISOC doesn't want to have any fiduciary responsibility of these contracts. So, well, okay, that puts it into 2B, for instance. But selecting that beforehand without actually knowing that what are the requirements might or might not give the right answer, but I think it's more random what the answer would be.
So to follow up on that a little bit, Sean Turner, I agree that giving a bucket of money to a bunch of lawyers results in that bucket of money getting spent. We don't want to do that. I like the idea of writing down in our words what it is, and then the lawyers go off and say, great, because there's the IRS, what's going to happen is they're going to say, if you want to be in 2B, where you're a supporting organization or one of these three things, there are tests. So whatever words we use, the lawyers that we're going to hire are going to be like, yes, you meet all of the three tests, the two tests in the first two cases, and there's three tests in the third case. And that's going to be okay. And whatever words we come up are going to get translated into, tax legalese, and we can go there. And if we can't meet the tests, then we can't be 2B. We got to be 2A. That's just how it's going to work. So, I mean, we can armchair tax lawyer our way into many things, but at the end of the day, if we write down the words we want, get a tax lawyer, give them a document, have them review it, yay or nay, we can know if it's going to fit or not. So I think we shouldn't try to reinvent U.S. tax law here. That's my main point.
Yeah. Just to agree with Stephen and Ted and anyone else that has spoken about, doing things in parallel, I think you are building momentum within the community, so you don't want to lose that probably. So I think chartering something and getting the community as a whole basically to work on that, I think is the right approach. Of course, you mentioned about having IETF leadership work with the ISOC board. And before I was talking about ISOC's economic commitment to that. In addition to that, we have a set of focus areas for the board, and supporting the IETF in this basically regard is one of them. So if you need, the trustees to spend more cycles or ISOC's lawyers, whatever, this can happen actually fairly quickly. So in that sense, don't think that, we're going to do this in parallel and the other process is going to take forever. We can actually expedite that. So I think we can, I agree with Sean, we can actually move forward quite quickly.
At this point, we're really cutting the mic lines. Just see.
Hi, hello, this is John. Just something I've heard a number of times is something between 2A and 2B. I'm sorry. 2A and 2B are mutually exclusive, and they are mutually exclusive by designs that we can't change. We're engineers. We love to invent things, but we have to stop being so damn creative when we're living in a context we can't change. Either we have a subsidiary or we don't. If we don't, we can mangle things around so that it looks a little more subsidiary-ish. If we have a subsidiary, we can mangle things around so that they look a little more integrated, but we got to make a choice. Don't compromise, make a choice. Thank you.
Portia Winsdanley. I am the interim IED, and I've had the opportunity to listen to the community to see where you all stand on this issue. There's one thing that I did want to point out, and that's the legal issue when considering moving to the subsidiary option, and that is that there are times when the organization will need a tax ID code, something as simple as that on the legal side. And that makes a big difference in terms of being able to move forward with work that needs to be done in a way that is that makes sense and streamlines processes, and not having to go and go through several different levels to get something done. So there is a legal issue that is beyond. I think governance issues most definitely can be worked out, but it's those legal things that makes the organization make sense as a subsidiary and as it grows up into the next phase of IASA 2.0.
Thanks. So I hear kind of opinions all over the place a little bit on next steps, I will say. What I'm inclined to do is certainly to kick off some coordination with the ISOC board to understand things better from the ISOC perspective, and kind of this sort of superficial understanding of what the options are, as Sean kind of articulated. I think those are low-hanging fruit that we can get going on right away. I come from the school of thought that we do not charter working groups with these kind of broad amorphous charters when we don't really know what the goal is or what we're trying to solve for. And we're not really there, but we're also not really at the place, I think, where like I can cancel my lunch meeting and go write a real focused charter for what the work is that we're going to do in the IETF. So I'm willing to kind of continue processing what happened today and try to draft up a charter that we can maybe kick around for a while on the list and see how people feel about. But I don't have a real crisp sense of what we're asking the IETF community to commit to right now, as far as what we would do in a working group. But maybe if we do that in parallel with the other things I just articulated, then that clarity will come. So that's kind of my sense of where we are right now. I don't know. You can disagree if that doesn't seem right.
I mean, I think there is, I could see some value in performing precisely the exercise that Sean described. I think of, here are some options we think are attractive, right? Enough that we can articulate to lawyers, will we meet these tests with these options? And I think the kinds of things that we see in the design team document, I think are actually not that far from that. So I could kind of imagine trying to scope something that maybe had that very tactical goal. I don't think you need a working group to do that, though.
Yes.
So as a next step, we could say what we want to do is refine that down into something that will at least allow those tests to be executed. And that seems like something the community does, right? That's not something that the lawyers do. Like, we need to figure out for ourselves what we think are the interesting things to ask them that could be tested.
Yep, sounds good. All right, thanks.
Thank you. Anyone need to sign a blue sheet who did not? They are here. Come sign one.